We're joined today by Berwood Yost, director of the Floyd Institute Center for Opinion Research at Franklin and Marshall College. Just a little over a week ago, President Joe Biden announced his withdrawal from the race, making Kamala Harris the presumptive Democratic nominee. What are your early expectations of what a Harris-Trump presidential race will look like in the polls?
Well, we've had a little time to digest this news, as you know, Francine, and we've actually started to see some polls come in that really show that the dynamics of the race have changed tremendously. It was pretty clear that after the president's debate performance, some of the concerns that voters had about him, particularly voters in his base, had sort of grown and, in fact, started to impact, I think, other voters, perhaps some independent voters, some moderate voters, people who hadn't made up their mind yet. And clearly, President Trump had probably a 4 or 5 point advantage in this state. That's really striking when you compare it to, say, 2020. The same point in the race, maybe 100 days before Election Day or so, President Biden, the challenger in 2020, was probably averaging about 48, 49% in the polls in the state. At the point he withdrew, his numbers were below or around 40%. He had really just was not in a good position. So I think immediately Kamala Harris's entrance into this race and the way that the Democratic Party has really rallied around her created some enthusiasm, and we see it in the polls. I mean, right now it looks like this race, instead of being a Trump 4 or 5 point advantage, is now tied. And perhaps a poll today suggested that Harris has even a slight advantage. And so the dynamics of this race have changed completely. I think in part because the elements of President Biden's support that he had in 2020, particularly young voters, voters of color, that had drifted away from his candidacy, have sort of come back to Kamala Harris and to Democrats. And so that coalition that elected Biden in 2020 has really reassembled itself in the face of this new candidate.
Now, a moment ago, if I could just go back, you referenced that June 27th debate where President Biden's performance was somewhat criticized. Do you think that that was the sole deciding factor, or were there indications, if you look at perhaps past polling and his favorability ratings, that you might have seen this coming from months prior?
So, it's been pretty clear for at least a year, probably more, that the president's job approval ratings were really low. And I think that had his approval numbers stayed at the same place they were, he was headed for defeat in Pennsylvania. There's probably no doubt about that. I think what made the debate so important was that there was a general sense that the race was kind of stagnant and that the debate itself would become an inflection point. I think the Biden campaign thought that they would show with a strong performance, they could start bolstering how people felt about the president, improve their feelings about his time in office, and he would take off from there. That clearly didn't happen, and it went the other way. It went against the president because of his debate. So, I think it's a strong debate performance would have probably changed the dynamic of the race, just like the poor debate performance did as well. But I think there were clear indications that he was a weak candidate heading into the debate, and he really needed a strong showing to stay competitive, and he just didn't deliver that.
And you had mentioned that some early polls that have come out in the last week or so since President Biden's withdrawal are showing that Kamala Harris is receiving a little bit of a bump at the polls. Do you think that this is a reactionary honeymoon, or do you think this is something that might be sustainable leading to November?
Well, we'll see. That's the problem with having only about a week since the announcement to see what's happening. I mean, this could just be akin to a convention bounce where all the good news from a convention helps lift a candidate for a little bit, and then the race returns to normal. Normal is a tied race. And so I think that's about where we are. Maybe Kamala Harris has a slight advantage at this point. I think we'll know in the next 2 weeks whether or not this is the new normal, or that was just a positive bump. I mean, there has been campaign advertising now from the Trump campaign attacking Harris on a number of issues. And so we'll see if that starts to drag her down. She is also going up in the air with her own positive commercials about her candidacy. So those two things may kind of counteract each other. So I think we probably have to think about evaluating this in stages. And the early stage was tremendously positive for Harris. We'll see what the next stage brings.
How do you think President Biden's withdrawal will impact down-ticket races in Pennsylvania?
So I really think that in large part is what drove him from the race. That is concerns that elected Democrats had, particularly in contested races, about what a poor performance at the top of the ticket would mean for their own races. So if the president were to have lost the popular vote by 3 points, that probably had implications for the number of Democrats that would win in Congress, say, and might also affect the ability of Senate Democrats to get reelected. And so I think that there were real concerns that a poor showing at the top of the ticket would have had some down ballot consequences for Congress. I think that was also part of what drove the President Biden from the race. I think those elected officials were really concerned that that was another obstacle to their reelection if they were in a close race.
I'd like to talk about demographics just very briefly. Is there a typical demographic that you can use to describe the majority of Pennsylvania voters?
I think the majority of Pennsylvania voters are white voters, probably about 80% or so, if I'm remembering correctly, of the voters in the upcoming election will be white. So that's probably the largest single demographic. I mean, if you're getting into smaller subgroups, white non-college educated voters would be another large voting bloc in this state. So there's any number of ways to split up the state. I mean, there's a large number of suburban voters in Pennsylvania, sizable number of urban and rural voters. You could really slice the state demographically into any number of categories. But for my basic look at Pennsylvania politics over the past decade or so, the most important defining features of the voters in the state have to do with geography, race, and educational attainment. And I guess we can't forget about gender. And those things all sort of work together collectively to help, shape sort of perceptions of the race and the candidates and how people are going to vote.
Do you think that Kamala Harris, being both a woman of color and also nearly 20 years younger than Donald Trump, will that energize different constituencies?
Well, I think it already has, right? I mean, the concerns that voters had about President Biden's age were pretty strong. Something like 40% of the voters that we talked to in our polls said that he was too old to run for office. Another share thought they were both candidates were too old for office. So when you add that up, a lot of voters had real concerns about President Biden's age. I think that was really holding him back, and particularly with younger voters who, my understanding is, are really having a tough time economically because of all the inflation, which they blame on the president. And rightly or wrongly, that's who they blame for that. So, I think that's an important group that we've seen sort of come back to Democrats since he's left the race. And, how much it's really hard, I think, Francine, to disentangle his evaluations of his job performance from how people were feeling about his age and his capabilities for another term. That stuff, I think, was all mixed up. But I think it's very clear, as I described earlier, that Democratic base that elected him in 2020 and that had really started to fall apart in 2024 has sort of reassembled itself, at least at the moment.
As we speak in late July, Kamala Harris has not yet announced a running mate. However, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro has been considered as a contender. What would a Shapiro-Harris ticket mean in Pennsylvania?
Well, there's no doubt that current polling suggests that Josh Shapiro is the most popular elected office holder in the state. He has a very strong favorability rating, very good job performance rating. Voters here like him. And I think if he were on the ticket, it would certainly signal to Pennsylvania voters that President Kamala Harris, who hopes to be president, who's seen as, I think, a bit more progressive in her viewpoints, has adopted a running mate who is not quite viewed not quite as progressive. And so having a more moderate candidate on the ticket, somebody who knows how to speak to the issues that are important to Pennsylvania, things like jobs, things like fracking, things like education, somebody who knows how to govern. I think all of those things would be a net positive. This Governor Shapiro, as I said, is pretty popular. I think he would help the top of the ticket here. At the end of the day, most people are voting for the president, not for the vice president. But I certainly think that voters would consider her choice and what it means about the policies she might promote and helping them think about voting for her in November.
Earlier this month, there was an assassination attempt against Donald Trump. How did that affect voter sentiment toward Donald Trump?
I think immediately after, there were probably some positive movement in his, say, favorability ratings. More people felt more positively about him. So I think he did have, some voters who felt a little more positively inclined towards former President Trump after the shooting. I think some of those numbers have receded. I mean, in part, I think that balance had to do with his the perception and his own statement saying that we need more unity in this country. And I think that made some people think, well, that's a good sign. That's what many folks want. He's since sort of backed away from that sort of sentiment and tone. And I think we've seen his favorability numbers, for instance, kind of go back to where they were. So I think he had a moment there where some more people felt positively about him. If he could have maintained that tone about unity, about less division, I think he would have held on to some of those folks, but that hasn't happened. So I think we've returned to where we were. Let me also add, Francine, it's really hard to disentangle some of these things because they happen so quickly and so close to one another. And the tools we have in polling, which are helpful, are not all that precise. And so unless you add weeks between events, it's hard to know which one thing is affecting people's sentiments. And as you know, this month, the events that have happened this past 3 or 4 weeks have really been compressed. And so it's hard to say what one thing moved voters in what specific way.
Well, with all the attention that's been focused both on the assassination attempt and then later President Biden's withdrawal, do you think that third-party candidates such as Robert Kennedy Jr., do they still pose a threat as a spoiler?
Well, look, I think there's going to likely be 5 candidates on the ballot in Pennsylvania, one of which would be Robert Kennedy. We'll have a Green candidate. We'll have a Libertarian candidate as well. So, the impact of a third-party candidate is particularly profound when people don't like both their choices at the top of the ticket. And some of the polling that we've seen suggests what was true before Biden dropped out, that maybe a quarter of voters didn't really like either candidate, that has changed now, and that there are fewer of those, what they've referred to as double haters, and it's back down to normal levels, 6, 7, 8%. And if that's the case, then the third-party candidates, while still potentially having an impact, probably don't have as big an impact because you don't have 25% of voters looking for an alternative. You have 6 or 7%. And so I think that leads to less volatility in their vote choices. But we don't know. We're still early in the Harris-Trump race, and we'll see if her unfavorable numbers increase and we get back to where we were in earlier in this election, where lots of people weren't satisfied with either choice. But that's not the case now.
Can you just talk briefly about what issues have typically been most important to voters in this race, and has that changed in light of recent events over this past month?
I think that's a good question. I think economic concerns have really always been at the heart of this race. President Biden's job approval ratings, his low job approval ratings, come from the way people believe he's handled the economy. People are really concerned about inflation. Those sorts of things haven't gone away. So I think economic concerns will continue to be a central part of this race. Of course, I think abortion rights issues will also be a part, as in 2022 in those midterm elections. That's going to be a big part of people's decision making, at least for some voters. And I actually think that becomes a bit more pronounced because Kamala Harris as a candidate seems more comfortable talking about abortion rights and choice than Joe Biden did. Those were probably the two key issues coming into the race. As Biden and Trump campaigned, I think that those two remain the big issues. Of course, we can't discount immigration, which seems to be getting a lot of airtime in ads that are airing now. So that's certainly an issue. But I think that issue is really symbolic about economic people's feelings of economic security. I think that's how that issue is being used. Both personal safety and economic safety. And so I think at heart, much of this discussion that's going to continue to take place is about policies that can affect the economy and make people's lives better. I think that's what we'll continue to see as this campaign goes on.
What areas will you focus on as you continue to conduct polls leading to the November election?
Well, we've got a lot of ground to make up. I mean, normally at this point, we've been tracking the candidates' favorability ratings, their head-to-head matchups, how people feel about their performance, how they're rated on these issues, who can do a better job of handling these issues. We normally have months and months worth of data at this point so we can see the trend lines. We're going to collect all that data, but we're really starting fresh with the Harris and the Trump campaign. And so those are the issues we'll be tracking, just as we were before. We just are starting from at a later time period in the race than we normally would.
Berwood Yost, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Francine. Good to see you.